Hi, it's Rob from the Brush and Boltgun. Today I'm going to be doing a tutorial on how to paint Celestine, the Living Saint, for the Sisters of Baal. It's quite a long video and there's quite a lot of different techniques in there, so if you want to see any of the techniques done as a separate video, just give me a shout. And also I'll link in the video for the scrolls and the parchments that was done up last week. So the first colour that we're going to use is Vallejo Black. This can be to do her hair and some of the areas in the joints of her armour. Now the model itself has been sprayed with Citadel Retributor Armour first, and then the wings have been sprayed separately with, I think it was Army Painter White. It could have been the Citadel Corax White though, I can't really remember which one it was, but it's just basically a white spray paint. So you're just going to fill in all these bits with nice black. We'll get on to the next colour. So next up, we're using a little bit of Citadel Mephiston Red. This is mainly to do the cloak. And as well as the cloak at the back there, you've got the kind of loincloth part and the strip down the front of her armour as well. There's also later on, there's a long wire coming out the back of the skull there and two little wires either side of it. I also paint those red a little bit later on, so you can paint those red now. We just want a nice smooth red coat on all of these areas, so it's ready for the shades later on. Now we're going to use some Vallejo White. We're going to be using this to paint up the doves which are flying out from just behind her. Now the way I'm painting up these doves in this video is really simple, but it does look decent. It's a nice way to do it if you want it for the tabletop, because it'll look really nice, it'll stand out, and because the wings, also the doves, are a really gleaming white colour, it does stand out above everything else. Next up we're going to be using Citadel Kislev Flesh. Now this is a lighter colour from the flesh-based Vallejo colour that I usually use, but as Celestine in the pictures on the Games Workshop site looks quite pale, I figured it'd be worth going for a lighter skin colour, just to keep it more in line with that. Once you've got a nice smooth coat of that on the face, you can move on to the next colour. Might take a couple of layers this because it does seem to be quite a thin paint, just in general. You'll also be doing a coat of this on each hand as well. Next up is Citadel Rakarth Flesh. I'm going to use this to paint the scrolls which are coming down beneath her, and also the purity seal on the back of her cloak. Now if you've got an old brush, you can do these scrolls at the bottom really quickly. You can see here this is an old Citadel medium layer brush which has got no point left to it, but it's what I use to do a quick and smooth layer on things like this. I'm going to use a little bit of Vallejo Model Air Chrome. I think this is also a good colour to use for Celestine. It's a really bright metallic, and even when you put the shade on there, it still stands out a lot more than the likes of Lead Belcher or Gunmetal Grey or anything like that. So you want to be giving all the tubing, the kind of zip down the front of her armour, the edges to the sword blade, the halo at the back, and any of the little fleur-de-lis which are on her armour. I'm going to give them a nice coating of this because it's a, as I say, a bright metallic. Gets them looking good. Now we're going to move on to Citadel Retributor Armour. We're going to actually paint the Retributor Armour back onto that shoulder pad there, and also onto both wings where you've got the frame and the backpack between the two wings at the back as well, which has been caught by the white spray. So you want to reapply all the gold and get that looking nice and smooth. It will take a little bit of time to do this if you sprayed the wings white, If we just give it a nice smooth coat of Retributor Armour, that'll all look good. Next up, we're going to use a little bit of Wazdaka Red just to do the purity seal on the back of the cloak there. Should also note that the halo above her head hasn't been painted with Model Air Chrome yet, and it will be in the next section of video, so if you didn't paint that previously, paint it up Vallejo Model Air Chrome now. So next up, we're going to start on the shades. We're going to use Reikland Flesh Shade just to do her face. So you want to give that a nice coat of Reikland Flesh Shade just so it gets in all the recesses and darkens up those areas around the eyes and just under the chin. We're also using this to do her hands, so make sure they get a good coat as well. Next up, it's Citadel Seraphim Sepia. I'm going to be using this to do all the scrolls and also the purity seal and the skull on the back there. Say the seal, I mean a little bit of parchment on the seal. If the sepia does pool in these areas, you just want to get rid of that pooling bit and spread it out a little bit more. Now we're going to use Citadel Technical Paint, Nihilak Oxide. What you're going to do is paint all the feathers on the doves, on the underside and the top side too, and some little parts on the back and just sort of like around the neck, and a few little bits on the torso as well, which you'll see when it tips over. Now we're going to use a slight little bit of Drakenhof Nightshade. We're just going to use this on the tips of the wings. Don't need to apply too much of this, just a little bit on each wingtip should be fine. Now I'm going to use Citadel Agrax Earthshade. I'm going to use this on all of the gold. Now I'm going to do a video on doing a couple of different types of gold, I think, in the near future, just because there are quite a few different methods of doing it. This is my go-to method because I really like the colour that it makes it. But there are a number of different ways that you can do it, where you can make it look more red, or you can make it look a kind of brighter yellowy colour. So I'll have a look at a few of them in a few weeks' time. Now I'm going to use Citadel Druchii Violet. I'm going to use this on all of the red. The only part that we're not going to use it on is the two strips up the front of her armour. We're going to be using Carroburg Crimson on them. I mean, if you want to use the Druchii Violet on those as well, you can do. It doesn't really make that much difference. I only add that to give it a slight difference in colour, but as I say, it doesn't make too much difference, so if you want to use Druchii Violet for the lot, then that's fine. Here's the Carroburg Crimson. We're just going to use that on the two strips up the front there. As I say, if you want to use Druchii Violet instead, that's fine, it works just as well. And using Carroburg Crimson on this doesn't really change it too much. Just gives it a very, very slight different look. Nuln Oil is going to be the final shade, I think. You can use this on all the silvery metallics where you've painted the Model Air Chrome. Also, when you're putting the Druchii Violet on, The roses that are falling from her sword hand, you can also give them a coat of that too. I'm going to use a quick and easy method of getting those roses. White with the purple tint. The next colour we're using is Vallejo Pale Grey Wash. I'm just going to paint this over all the recesses on the cloak, on the back of the loincloth there, also on the white shoulder pad, or rather on the white wings on the left shoulder pad. Like so. Now we're just going to be using a little bit of Citadel Nuln oil. I'm going to be using this to do the recesses between each of the kind of feathers on the wings at the back here. Now you don't want to be spreading this all over the place like I usually do with the shade. You just want to be getting as close into those lines as possible. If you can do it closer than this, then crack on. It's just a pretty rough way of doing it. The less that you spread about though, the less you'll have to cover when you come back to repainting this with white, because you're only going to have these feathers with the shade and then white, so that they're as gleaming and as brilliant white as possible. So now we're going to go back to the gold of the armour with the Citadel Retributor Gold, and we're going to start reapplying that colour to all of the armour plates. So while you're painting this up, you want to be thinking about where the light is going to be catching the gold, where it's going to be illuminated the most, and where it's going to be maybe reflecting some of the darker areas. You want to be reapplying the Retributor armour to a lot of the model, but if it's on the underside of an arm or a leg, or it's not going to be catching that much light, then try to leave a little bit more of the shade than you would do if it was on top of the armour. Next colour that we're going to use is Citadel Liberator Gold. This is a lighter gold than the previous one, and we're just going to use this to do around the top half of the arms, and the legs, and anywhere that's going to be catching the light. You want to be adding the Liberator Gold to and highlighting that previous coat of Retributor armour. I'm going to carry on with this all over the model. When we come back, we'll do the extreme highlight. So you can see where we've applied the highlights to the gold there and how it's looking so far. It's generally the top sides that have been highlighted with the Liberator Gold. And now we are going to add a little bit of Vallejo Model Air Chrome to the Liberator Gold. I'm going to start doing the extreme highlights on this, on all the areas where it'll be catching the light. Like so. You can see with all the highlights there how it's looking now. Now we're just going to work on Vallejo Model Air Chrome on its own and reapply some of the silvers to the fleur-de-lis, the sword blade, and the kind of zip down the front of the tubing that comes down from a gorget under her arm there. Here I'm just changing brush, and I've gone back to the old battered medium layer brush, and I'm just going to dry brush that onto this tube. Now there are lots of areas on Celestine that are just pure white, so this section here there's going to be quite a few minutes of just painting white on different areas, so covering how I'm painting the white on the wings, how I'm painting the white on the cloak, on the little doves. So there is quite a lot of speeded up footage here, which is just showing the different areas that are all being painted up with pure white. So on the wings, where you put the null oil, you will have to do a couple of layers just to get rid of any that you've splodged onto the actual strips of the wings. Now this is how I'm going about painting the larger feathers on the doves. It's just basically doing a straight line of the completely white paint from one end of the feather to the other. And then for the cloak, we're going to be doing these raised areas as white as you can possibly get them, and then fade them into the grey in the recesses. So going back to the little doves here, give you a bit more of an example of how I'm painting up the feathers. I'm painting the top of the wing, which is a pure white line, and kind of stippling the paint on with the very tip of the brush just to give that kind of mottled and almost feathered effect on the body of the doves and also on the wings where they haven't got the feathers painted on. For the roses, now when you watch here you can see me starting off using the Army Painter Wargamer character brush. And instead, because it starts getting a little bit too far into the recesses using a brush like that, I just went to the Old Faithful, the knackered old medium layer brush, and just dry brushed the white over the top of them. Now by brushing in different angles and things, you can make the top of them a lot whiter than the sides, and kind of grade that in a little bit. And here you can see me lightly blending in the white into the grey. This is just using the normal white paint with a little tiny spot of water mixed to it just to thin it ever so slightly. That just allows you to smooth that into the grey a little bit easier. So you can see all the white finish there. It is a very pure and bright model this, so the whiter you can get it the better on all those areas. It really does want to gleam, so it stands out a lot more. Now we're just going to be using some Vallejo German Grey. I'm going to use that to do the eyes, the feet and the beaks on the doves. Now you can see on the doves I've left some of them a little bit more blue than the others, and that is just so that they stand out a little bit more against the background of the white wings. The underside slightly bluer than the top side because obviously they're not going to catch as much light underneath. Like so. Now I'm just going to go back to Celestine's face. We're going to go with Citadel Kislev Flesh once again. We're going to work on her hands and her face, reapplying the base coat and just making sure that you leave the Rakarth flesh shade in all of the recesses. I'm trying here to paint the little individual segments on the fingers, just to give that a little bit more of a realistic look. Now we're going to add a little bit of Vallejo white to the Kislev flesh. I'm just going to start on the first layer of highlights on the skin. I'm going to be highlighting the areas that be catching the light, so where any ridges are, on the knuckles, the backs of the hand, tops of the hand where that's facing up. Generally anywhere where it'd be catching light if the light is shining straight down on it. Now we're going to add a little bit more white to the previous mix, I'm going to do one more highlight on the skin. I was a bit awkward painting the face. To be honest, if I redid it again, which I probably won't do because it took an age, but if I was to do it again, I wouldn't stick the hair on the head before painting the face, just because the way the hair hangs down, it makes it quite difficult to get that other eye. You can get one of them really easy, the other one's a lot harder to get to. It just means you'll be able to do a spot-on job with the face. Now we're just going to use a little bit of Vallejo white, just on its own, to paint up the eyes. As I say, it's quite difficult to get this eye underneath the hairline there. You can just about manage it, but it is a bit of a pain. Now we're going to return to Vallejo black. I'm going to start reapplying that to the hair and the joints in the armour and the black area on the sword, just to make sure that they're all black for when we start highlighting those in a moment. Like so. Next up we're going to use Vallejo German Grey, and that is going to be to add the first layer of highlights to the hair and also to the black areas of the armour. Now we will return to this a little bit later on, because as we get towards the end I'm not quite happy with the hair. But if you get the hair right the first time here, then you can probably skip that little bit at the end. But we want to be highlighting the hair with the German Grey here, thinking about where the light's going to catch it. Then next we are going to move on to Citadel Mechanicus Standard Grey, just to do one final highlight on the hair and the black areas between the armour plates. If you do accidentally put a little bit too much of the one colour on here, where I managed to get a little bit too much German Grey on, just go back, get the previous colour, which is black in that case, and just add that over it and redo it again. Now we're starting a part that was covered with last week's video, which is the scrolls at the bottom. So we're starting by applying Citadel Rakarth Flesh to pretty much the whole of the scroll. You want to be trying to keep some of the areas, the undersides, where it'd be shaded with the Seraphim Sepia, or if there's a little crease or a ripple in it, you want to keep the Sepia in there, just to sort of break up the overall colour. So it's not just one flat Rakarth Flesh colour all over. So you'll be able to see at the start of the next clip the kind of areas where I'd left a bit of a gap. And now we're going to add some white to the Rakarth Flesh, and we're going to start doing highlights on these. Now the highlights on it I've done on top of where there's ridges in the parchment. So where there's a little crease, you're doing the highlights on those bits. We're also going to be doing the wider areas that will be catching the light, like this part here, or the flat surfaces that are facing pretty much upright at the base of the scrolls. Next up we're going to use a little bit more white mixed in with the previous mix. We're going to start to highlight the scrolls even more. Now this is mainly around the ridges and things, so where you highlighted previously, the areas that are more highlighted are going to get a little bit more of this extreme highlight added to them. Just finish off this layer, and we'll come back and start on the scroll work. For this we're going to start off using black. Now, other than the white on the cloak, this will be one of the few times where I've added a little tiny bit of water to the black just to thin it ever so slightly, which makes it easier to work with when you're doing these thin lines. What you want to try and do when you're doing freehand stuff like this is give yourself a basic outline. Now you can either draw it on with pencil, which is what I do with the Lamenter's shoulder pads and certain designs, but if you want to just paint it on by brush, then just do a rough kind of outline of what you want to do and then just slowly work on it. And don't be afraid if you do get part of it wrong and end up putting too much black on there, or when you're trying to smooth out the edge with a bit of the previous colour and you get a bit too much in there. Just keep working at it, keep gently edging the colours in, and you will get it. It's just a case of practice, and if you make a little mistake, just go over it and crack on. So here I'm trying to do some letters in squares. Now that one, you may notice that the lines are a bit thick there. That was because I was using the brush, not dragging the point. So if you use it dragging the point, you can see how thin the lines are that you can get on that. If you use it with the point going, if the point's facing upwards and you're dragging it side to side, it will splay the brush and you will get quite a thick line. So you can see you've done some of the scroll work here. Now we're going to use Citadel Carrowbird Crimson just to put an outline around the fleur-de-lis and the Inquisition symbols. We're also going to do some text and different pieces on the scrolls themselves. So much like you have done with the black, you're going to do the same with the Carrowbird Crimson. You can see just adding a little bit of text here, like a slight, very thin squiggly line, does go a long way to looking like text. Now here I've started doing one of the little designs from a page of the Necronomicon from Evil Dead, or Ash vs the Evil Dead, or Army of Darkness, whichever one you want to go for. But it's the skull with the big white eyes. It's got some vertebrae coming out the bottom of it. The rest of it's kind of a general reddy colour. Now you can see there I've put too much Carrowbird Crimson on, but it doesn't matter too much. If you ever do that, you can just use your brush to spread that around and use it on other parts where you're using that colour. Now we're going to be using a little bit of Citadel Rakarth flesh mixed with Citadel Ushabti bone. And we're going to start working on the skull on the backpack. Now again, when you're highlighting this, you want to be thinking about where the light's going to be catching the skull and trying to highlight those areas a bit more. Now we're adding a little bit of white to the previous mix. Now we're just going to do a quick highlight on there. Just give that a little bit of a lighter colour on the sockets, the teeth, the nose, around the Inquisition badge, and a little bit on the top of the skull. Now we're going to start working on the red again. So it's Citadel Mephiston Red to start this off. You want to be applying this to all of the ridges, making sure you leave that Druchii Violet or the Carrowbird Crimson in the recesses. But you want to get a nice smooth red on the areas that you're going to start highlighting. This is going to be all the areas that be catching the light. Now if you look at this loincloth at the front here, it's actually slightly tilted underneath, so you're not going to highlight this as much. But you do want to get just a little bit of a highlight on the ridges and on some of the flat areas, just so that it's got that little bit of extra colour going across the cloak. Now we're going to use Citadel Mephiston Red once more. And this is just to do the decoration going across the bottom of the cloak here. See the line's a bit thick at the top there where I first put it on, because I was having difficulty gauging how smooth that area was. Misgauged it, the line ended up quite fat there. So all we do there is use a little bit of white at the end to straighten that up. But here we're adding the pattern across the bottom of the cloak. Again, when you're doing it, you can paint it carefully. If you get any little mistakes or you make one line too thick or one too thin, you can just go over them either with the previous colour or with the colour that you're working with. So here I'm doing the vertical lines on those. One of those little arms is a bit too long, so we're going to move the vertical line a bit closer in. then just use a little bit of white to tidy that up afterwards. So now we're adding a little bit of Citadel Fire Dragon Bright to the Mephiston Red. Again, now that we've got this highlight on, we're just going to be highlighting the ridges and the areas that are going to be catching the light more. And this is where you can really set apart some of those discrete ridges in the cloth material. So whereas you might have coated the whole area in Mephiston Red, now when you're doing these highlights you can add a little bit more definition to those ridges and the areas that are lifting up from the rest of the cloak. Now we're going to add a little bit more Fire Dragon Bright to the previous mix, and again we're going to start highlighting these red areas. So as always, you're trying to pick out the really small ridges on these coloured areas here, just to make them stand out ever so slightly more than they did previously. Now, while we're using this Army Painter Wargamer character brush, this is just so we can get the thinnest lines possible as we're doing the highlights here. Now moving on to Citadel Mechanicus Standard Grey, we're going to start applying a few more little highlights to the hair. As I said earlier, I wasn't too happy with the way this turned out, so I thought I'd add a few more little highlights to it, just try and lighten that up a little bit so it doesn't look quite so much like a darkened mass on top of her head. Hopefully looks a little bit more like hair. There's a few more individual hairs on there. I'm quite happy with how that's looking now. Next up, we're going to start working on the power sword. So we're using Citadel Ahriman Blue. We want to paint the little kind of circuit piece which runs from the hilt of the sword. Now what we're trying to do here on the blade is trying to make little almost lightning shapes with the paint. So you're going to be dragging that brush away from the tip as always. So you want to be doing little angular turns in the electricity as going up the blade. You want to get nice, smooth, thin blue lines to show that. Now the next layer is going to be Ahriman Blue with a little bit of white mixed into it just to lighten that up. And you mainly want to be painting this on the areas around where two lines will cross each other, so where the lightning forks, or the electricity forks, and a little bit further up, so maybe about 2/3 of the areas that you've painted with Ahriman Blue you now want to be doing with this coat, but all mainly around where the joins in the electricity are. Now I'm going to add a little bit more white. I'm going to start working that into the joins again. So with each layer here, you're getting closer and closer to where the electricity splits. So it's always going to be, the lightest point is always where there's going to be a join in the electricity. So that eventually you will just have a plain white spot in there. But at the moment we're just working out from each join and getting a bit closer each time we do a new layer. If that's not very clear, just shout out and I'll try and describe it better in the text. I'm going to add a little bit more white to the mix. I'm going to start doing a little bit closer to the joins in electricity again. I'm going to add a little bit more white to the previous mix. Once more, we're going to work our way closer and closer. This time we're just doing little tiny bits around each join because there's not really any need to do any more. like so. This final layer is going to be just white. You can be doing pretty much right in the centre of every join in the lightning or the electricity. You want to be just putting the smallest bit of white you can, just so that you can see it, and to show that the lightest part is where two parts of the electricity join. So some parts you'll just be adding a little tiny spot to it, others you might be adding a little kind of join in those areas. I'm just using a tiny little bit of Model Air Chrome to go over the bits that we got onto the silver with. The final thing that we're going to do is use a tiny little bit of Drakenhof Nightshade just to go over the eyes. Now with the Drakenhof Nightshade on the eyes, we're just going to use a little tiny bit of Vallejo White just to make those bright white again, so that you'll have the blue rim to them. Make them look like a little bit of a blue glow around them. Like so. And finally, we're going to use some Ahriman blue to do this shoulder pad where there's like a gemstone on it, like the Eldar ones. Just want to get a nice smooth coat of Ahriman blue on the gemstone. Now we're going to add a little bit of white to the Ahriman blue. We're just going to do a crescent around half of the gem on the bottom left hand side of the gem. Now we're going to add a little bit more white to the Ahriman blue. We're just going to do a slightly smaller crescent inside the ones that we've already done. And add a little bit more white once more. And do a slightly smaller crescent once again. We're just going to repeat this a couple more times, like so. So we're just going to add a little bit more of the Vallejo White to the Ahriman blue mix, and do one slightly lighter crescent. And finally, we're just going to use pure Vallejo White to do a really fine line on the bottom left hand edge of that. And then two small dots as a reflection on the top right hand corner. Finally, we're going to use some Citadel Drakenhof Nightshade. We're just going to darken up a few little sections of the gemstone just beneath where the reflections are. Like so. And that is the finished Saint Celestine. Now there's a few little bits I've added afterwards, which is the chrome on the halo on her backpack, and also chrome on the little studs on her front as well. You can see them in the picture after the outro. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and if you have, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future content. Also, think about subscribing to some of our other social media linked below. Thanks very much.